Crime and punishment throughout the medieval period in England is often assumed to have been horrifically brutal, with beheadings, hangings and horrific executions, such as the hanging, drawing and quartering. These punishments are often carried out in public, with the main aim as to scaring the population into submission, with the sentence being carried out to act as a deterrent. Still today, harsher sentences are given out by judges to deter the public from committing certain crimes, and the idea of a deterrent is a powerful thing. However, in England between the 17th and the early 19th century, this idea would rise to prominence in a rather brutal way. Today we look at the Bloody Code, a number of changes made to the judicial system in England that had a profound and notorious effect on the population. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Bloody Code as we know it today was a system of crimes in England in which people could be given the death penalty for. What's rather shocking with the code is the fact that by our standards in the 20th century, some of the crimes are rather minor and today wouldn't really meet a serious punishment, but during this time they could cost someone their life. In 1688, the number of crimes that carried the death penalty was 50, but this would greatly rise over the course of the next 100 years to more than 200 offences. The English legal system at the time was developing a reputation for brutality, and judges would rarely show any mercy. Laws were made by the rich, which were created to protect the population, and those who created the law, it's assumed, must have looked down on the lower classes and criminals. Those who created the law thought that the harsh imposition of mass executions for smaller crimes would have acted as a perfect deterrent, so people wouldn't think twice about committing a crime of any severity. So the more people who saw a public execution, the authorities thought, the more likely the rest of the population would obey the law. There were a huge amount of crimes that one could find themselves hanged for committing at this time. Some of these, as mentioned earlier, were rather petty, but some obviously were much more serious, such as murder. Some of the smaller crimes you could be hanged for were wrecking a fish pond, stealing from a rabbit warren, cutting down trees, writing a threatening letter, or being out at night with a blackened face. You could also be executed for stealing from a shipwreck, forgery, impersonating a Chelsea pensioner, begging without a licence if you'd been a soldier or sailor, stealing horses or sheep, destroying turnpike roads and arson. More serious crimes like murder and robbery would of course naturally carry the death penalty. Grand larceny was another one of these crimes, and it was defined as the theft of goods worth more than 12 pence, which at the time was about 5% of a skilled worker's weekly wage. So people could be killed for stealing something worth a rather minimal amount of money. So if the public saw someone being hanged for stealing a small object, the idea behind the Bloody Code was that these spectacles would frighten people into obeying the law. For example, in Durham, from 1816, the hangings were carried out in front of the Crown Court, with people coming far and wide to watch. In fact, some wealthier people even hired some of the balconies of local houses and pubs to get a better view of the events. Only around 20 or so of these crimes normally resulted in execution, and in around 70% of cases, the death sentence was actually commuted, with other options such as transportation favoured, or with a defendant being conscribed into the military or the navy. The huge number of capital offences was inflated by the endless Acts of Parliament, in which the statutes outlined that for specific crimes death was an option for sentencing. For example, there were 7 individual and slightly different offences of arson that each carried the death penalty. It's important to consider that the country was run at the time by the property-owning middle classes, who were keen to protect their property from the lower classes, who were looked down upon, and whose lives were considered of little value by those lawmakers. From 1735 to 1800, the Bloody Code was really played out, with 1,596 women being condemned to death for their crimes, but 1,243 would be reprieved and saved by the jury, with 356 not being so lucky. 32 of these women were executed brutally by burning, and the rest were hanged. 169 of these women and girls were executed for crimes against property, whilst 187 of them were killed for committing murder. Many of these women were convicted based upon circumstantial evidence that implicated them in their crimes, or on the strength of their own confessions. Hearings were usually rather short, and today these trials would be considered to be inadequate, as the defendants often lacked a real defence and couldn't rely on lawyers to fight their case. The only person who could really aid the defendant was a judge, but these trials really weren't fit for purpose. Across the country, over 1,000 men and women a year were being sentenced to death, but there were only a small proportion of these sentences that were being carried out. There was a growing movement across the country in the early part of the 19th century to reduce the number of crimes in which people could lose their lives for committing. In 1823, the Judgment of Death Act 1823 made the death penalty discretionary for all crimes except for treason and murder. This led to, over the next few decades, the amount of death sentences being reduced for crimes, and by 1861 there were only 5 capital offences, being murder, arson in a naval dockyard, espionage, piracy and high treason. So the Bloody Code was an attempt by the lawmakers to reduce crime by imposing the ultimate sentence for seemingly menial crimes. The idea behind the use of deterrence worked, however it was a bit excessive at the time to sentence someone to death for stealing something which in today's money would be worth around £30. Some evidence though does suggest that the Bloody Code did work, with fewer people being executed than before it was imposed. What can't be disputed though is the barbaric nature of the Bloody Code and how it played into the hands of the public, who seemingly would flock to public executions with excitement. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.